The factory fell silent. Conveyors slowed. Tools paused midair. Even the strip lights seemed to hum softer as the new manager yanked a dented metal lunchbox from the old janitor's hands. He smirked, a polished, public kind of cruelty, and tapped the rusted lid with a pen. "Everyone," he called, voice bouncing off the iron and glass, "place your bets. Stale bread? A bruised apple?" Laughter cracked across the floor. Boots shuffled. Eyes gathered. The janitor stood small but steady, gray hair slicked back, fingers trembling, age not fear. He said nothing. The lunchbox, scuffed from decades and etched with tiny initials, sat on the manager's desk like evidence in a trial. A single clasp held shut a lifetime of rumors. The manager toyed with it, milking the moment, enjoying the circle of bodies closing in around them. He leaned close to the janitor, whispering just loud enough to hurt. "Let's show them what nothing looks like." A hush thinned the air. The clasp clicked. Metal sighed. The lid rose, slow, almost reverent, as if the box itself were resisting. Silence became pressure. Faces tipped forward. A wrench rolled and rang somewhere far away. The manager peered inside. His grin faltered, only a fraction, only a heartbeat, yet enough to bend the room. And then everyone leaned closer. "Before we reveal what's inside, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe and like. It helps this story reach more people and you won't miss how this unraveling ends." In the next minutes, you'll see why a battered lunchbox stopped an entire factory, why a whisper can break a bully, and how silence can be louder than laughter. If you enjoy dark, slow-burn reveals with real consequences, this one's for you. Comment your city, subscribe for more, and tap like so the algorithm knows you're here. Ready? Let's open the box, properly. He arrived before sunrise as he had for more than 30 years. The factory's walls were already damp with morning dew, its windows glowing faintly like the eyes of something waking slowly. And there, in the quiet between darkness and day, walked the janitor, an old man whose name few remembered, though his presence was constant. His gray hair clung to his forehead, his thin shoulders curved forward under the weight of time, and in his right hand swung the object that defined him more than his name ever could, a battered metal lunchbox. The box looked worthless. Its paint had long since peeled. Its handle was wrapped in frayed cloth, tied and retied until the knots became part of its design. The clasp still clicked, though sometimes it protested with a squeal. Workers joked that it had survived wars, fires, and floods. They whispered that inside were crumbs and scraps, leftovers from days that had already forgotten him. No one asked politely. They only guessed, laughed, and carried on. Every morning he set the box down on the same wooden bench in the corner of the break room. He would fold his coat across his lap and sit in silence, eyes lowered, as younger men and women clattered around him with fresh coffees, glossy phones, and loud conversations. He never interrupted. He never asked to join. He was part of the room but never of it. To most, he was invisible. When machines roared to life and voices drowned in noise, his slow shuffle across the floor was background, like the hum of the lights or the smell of oil in the air. People noticed only what they wanted: the shine of a new machine, the bark of a manager, the rhythm of their own schedules. They did not see him polishing railings, collecting stray bolts, sweeping dust no one thanked him for. They did not hear his wheeze when the broom grew heavy or see his fingers crack open when water turned cold in winter. And yet he was always there, first to arrive, last to leave. The floor was clean because of him. The machines gleamed because he wiped them after others forgot. The doors opened smoothly because he oiled the hinges when no one was looking. He was the invisible glue, the shadow that kept order without demand. And still, to the eyes of his co-workers, he was nothing more than an old man with an old box. The new generation of workers treated him as a relic. Some offered half smiles when they passed him in the hall, the kind you give to a stranger you'll never see again. Others mocked more openly. They would whisper about his box, betting what he brought each day, making a spectacle out of something that wasn't theirs to touch. The words stung, though he never let them show. He walked steady, head slightly bowed, as if the ridicule could slide off him like rain. But behind that silence, stories swirled. One worker claimed he had once been rich but had lost it all. Another said he lived alone in a crumbling apartment filled with newspapers stacked to the ceiling. Some swore he was simply too stubborn to retire, clinging to the only life he knew. None of them asked. None of them cared enough to know the truth. It was easier to mock than to listen. The factory itself seemed to conspire with their cruelty. Bright posters on the walls showed glossy images of future innovation and modern workers. He was none of those things. His presence clashed with the image of progress. While younger men spoke of bonuses and promotions, he carried the same box, wore the same coat, and said the same few words when necessary. Good morning. Yes, sir. No, thank you. His vocabulary was not small, but he kept it small. Words were wasted where ears did not care. Still, there was dignity in his rhythm. Though others overlooked him, he carried himself with a quiet patience. His shoes, though worn, were always brushed. His coat, though patched, was always clean. And his lunchbox, though dented, was always clasped shut, never abandoned, never forgotten. He treated the box like a companion, setting it gently at his side wherever he went. The workers laughed at this ritual, but he never wavered. It was during those long, silent breaks that the divide between him and the others grew most visible. They shared jokes, videos, stories of weekends spent in noise and motion. He listened without inserting himself, sipping water slowly, his eyes drifting not to their faces but to the box. Sometimes he would rest his hand on it, as if the box itself reminded him he belonged, even when the room said otherwise. That was the janitor's life, measured not in promotions or praise, but in steps taken before dawn and silence endured after laughter. To most he was background. To himself he was steady. And in the rhythm of steady he found something greater than recognition. He found endurance. But endurance has a limit. And ridicule has a way of growing bold when it believes its target cannot resist. For years he endured. For years the box remained a joke. Until the day a new manager arrived. And mockery turned into a spectacle. The whispers began long before the new manager arrived. They floated through the corridors like smoke, slipping between the clatter of machines and the grind of gears. Workers leaned close to each other during breaks, nudging elbows and gesturing with smirks toward the corner where the old janitor sat with his lunchbox. "What do you think's in there today?" one would ask. "Crumbs from yesterday," another replied, loud enough for him to hear. Sometimes the guesses grew crueler. Maybe stones, maybe dust, maybe nothing at all. The jokes were small at first, thrown like pebbles in passing. But repetition sharpened them. They became habit, tradition, even passed down to the newer workers who joined the factory. A kind of initiation. Laugh at the janitor, sneer at the box. The old man never raised his head. He swallowed the mockery as though it were air, carrying it in silence. For the young and restless, that silence was proof enough. Proof that he was weak. Proof that he was nothing. In their eyes, he existed only to absorb their laughter. But cruelty rarely stays still. It grows bolder when left unchallenged. By the time the new manager walked through the doors, the ridicule had already set the stage. He was a man of polished shoes and sharper words, hired to modernize the factory. His hair slicked back like glass, his tie knotted with precision, his voice carrying the arrogance of someone convinced of his own brilliance. He noticed the janitor on his first day, of course he did. Everyone noticed. The contrast between the gleaming machines and the hunched figures sweeping near them was too great to ignore. But unlike others, the manager did not just laugh quietly. He saw opportunity. In the old man he spotted a prop. A stage for his authority. What better way to stamp power onto the factory floor than by mocking the one person who could not fight back? So he began small too. Passing by, he would wrinkle his nose and mutter, "Still carrying that junk, old man?" Or he'd glance at the box and say, "Careful, don't let the rats out." The younger workers chuckled, relieved to be laughing with him rather than at him. Each insult fed the next. The manager grew bolder. His audience grew louder. The janitor's silence stretched like rope, and the manager pulled harder every day, testing how far it would hold. Soon mornings became theater. The janitor entered with his box, and whispers followed him like shadows. Men leaned from machines, women exchanged knowing looks, apprentices covered their mouths to hide smirks. The manager orchestrated it all with a glance, a word, a sneer. At lunch breaks he made sport of the ritual. He would stand tall in the center of the room, tapping his fork against a glass to gather attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he'd announce, "our esteemed elder has joined us. Shall we guess today's delicacy?" "Bread crusts," someone shouted. "Rotten fruit," another added. The room erupted. And there in the corner sat the janitor. His coat folded across his lap, his box steady beside him. He neither defended nor explained. He simply stared at the floor, hands resting on the handle as though it anchored him. His silence deepened the laughter, made it echo louder against the walls. But not everyone laughed. There were always a few, the quiet ones, who looked on with unease. A young apprentice once whispered, "Isn't this too much?" only to be hushed by an older worker. "Stay out of it. You'll be next if you speak." So the cycle continued. Mockery became routine. The janitor became spectacle. His box, once just a private possession, became a public stage. And the manager, drunk on the approval of his audience, began to push harder. One afternoon, during a particularly busy shift, he stopped the janitor mid-step. In front of dozens of workers, he pointed at the box. "What's in there?" he barked. The old man lifted his eyes for the first time in weeks. His gaze was tired, not angry. Steady, not afraid. He gave no answer. The manager smirked. "I'll tell you what. Tomorrow you bring that box to my desk. We'll open it in front of everyone. Let's end the suspense." Gasps broke through the crowd. Some grinned at the thought. Others looked away, ashamed. But none spoke. None defended him. The janitor only nodded, slowly, calmly. Then he walked away, his box swinging gently at his side, the laughter chasing him down the hall like a pack of dogs. That night, the whispers spread faster than ever. The factory buzzed with anticipation. Bets were placed. Jokes were rehearsed. Tomorrow was no longer just another day at work, it was the promise of a show. But the janitor, alone in his small apartment, polished the clasp of his box. His fingers lingered on the dents and scratches, as if reading the story written into the metal. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply prepared in silence. Because silence, when held long enough, can thunder louder than any laugh. And the factory was about to learn that lesson. The morning arrived like a stage curtain rising. Word of the manager's challenge had spread through every corner of the factory. By dawn, excitement buzzed through the walls like electricity. Even before the shift began, workers gathered in hushed clusters, whispering predictions, stifling laughter, glancing toward the door where the janitor would soon appear. He came as always, steady steps, shoulders slightly bent, the familiar lunchbox swinging at his side. His gray hair caught the faint light from the windows, and his coat flapped softly as he walked. To him, the morning was no different than any other. To everyone else, it was a performance they had been waiting for. The manager wasted no time. He spotted the old man crossing the floor and raised his voice so it carried above the hum of machines. "There he is," he shouted, pointing like an actor announcing the villain of a play. "Our mystery man and his box of secrets." Laughter rippled across the room. Tools clattered as workers set them down, eager to watch. Apprentices leaned forward, wide-eyed. Even those who had once doubted the cruelty now felt the pull of curiosity. The janitor paused only for a moment, then continued his path toward the break room. His expression did not change. Calm, silent. His hand held the box, not tighter, not looser, always the same. But the manager pressed harder. "Bring it here," he commanded. "No more hiding." The old man stopped. The room hushed, anticipation thick as smoke. Slowly he turned, his eyes meeting the manager's. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then, without a word, the janitor crossed the floor and placed the lunchbox on the desk at the center of the room. It sat there, dented and dull, small against the polished wood. The contrast itself was almost laughable, the fragile box versus the gleaming office around it. And yet, the air grew heavy as if the box carried weight unseen. The manager circled it like a predator. "Today," he declared, "we settle the mystery. Today we show the truth." The workers leaned closer, some biting their lips to hold back laughter, others wide-eyed with nerves. The young apprentice from before clenched his fists, wishing someone, anyone, would stop this. But no one spoke. The janitor stood at the edge of the crowd, hands folded calmly in front of him. His face was unreadable, carved from years of patience. He seemed neither afraid nor ashamed. He seemed waiting. The manager tapped the lid. "Imagine, everyone, what kind of treasure he hides in here." He chuckled. "Bread crusts? Rotting fruit? A mouse or two?" The crowd erupted in chuckles. But the janitor did not flinch. The manager slammed his palm onto the box. "Enough games. We open this now." Gasps scattered through the room. The moment had arrived. The entire factory leaned toward the desk, drawn by an invisible rope of curiosity. Even the machines seemed quieter, as though the building itself waited. But then, unexpectedly, the manager pulled back. He smiled wide, savoring the tension. "No, not now," he teased. "We wait until lunch. Let the suspense build." Groans and laughter mixed together. Some clapped at the cruelty, others sighed in disappointment. The manager, delighted by his own sense of drama, leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming on the box. The janitor did not move. He simply stood there, eyes steady, gaze fixed not on the manager, not on the crowd, but on the lunchbox itself, as though it alone mattered. Hours crawled by, every tick of the clock stretching nerves tighter. Workers glanced at the box whenever they passed, whispering louder now, bolder. The anticipation gnawed at them, filling the air with restless energy. Finally, the lunch bell rang. The manager stood, straightened his tie, and placed both hands on the box. His grin gleamed. "Now," he said. "Now we see." The crowd surged closer, pressing into the room until shoulders touched and breaths mingled. The janitor remained still, almost apart from it all, as though the outcome was already written and he had no need to interfere. The manager's fingers toyed with the clasp. "Let's show them nothing," he whispered cruelly. "Let's show them who he really is." The crowd hushed once more. The moment of truth had arrived. But as the manager's hand gripped the clasp, the old man finally spoke. His voice was low, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "Be careful," he said. "Some truths are heavier than they look." The manager scoffed. The crowd leaned in, and the clasp gave its first trembling click. The box sat at the center of the manager's desk like a relic dragged from another age. Its once bright enamel had dulled into a mottled gray, the paint chipped in sharp lines, scars carved by years of use. The handle sagged under the weight of time, its cloth wrapping darkened by sweat and oil. The clasp, small, rust-bitten, stubborn, was the only thing keeping its secrets intact. The workers crowded around, their breath fogging the air, their murmurs blending into a single restless hum. Apprentices jostled each other for a better view. Veterans leaned against machines, pretending indifference but stealing glances. Even those who had laughed loudest earlier now shifted uneasily, as though the box itself had grown heavier under their eyes. The manager, savoring every second, stood tall behind him. He tapped the lid with his knuckle, each knock echoing like a gavel in a courtroom. "This," he said, "is history ending today. No more mystery. No more silence." His grin flashed. "We'll see the truth, and it will be nothing." Laughter rippled through the crowd, though thinner now, less certain. Anticipation had stretched too long, turning amusement into nervous tension. People wanted answers, not jokes. But the manager only dragged it further, reveling in control. The janitor stood apart, a shadow at the edge of the gathering. His gray eyes stayed fixed on the box, unblinking, unreadable. He made no move to stop what was coming, no plea to preserve his privacy. His silence was louder than protest, as though he had already accepted this moment. Or perhaps as though he had been waiting for it. The break room clock ticked louder than usual, each second slicing into the tension. Workers shuffled, the floorboards groaning under the press of bodies. The smell of sweat and oil thickened. No one touched their food. All eyes remained locked on the desk and the little box that promised revelation. The manager circled it once, dragging his fingers over the dents. "Imagine," he taunted, 30 years of secrets in this pathetic box. Crumbs, mold, maybe a rat's nest." He chuckled. "Let's see if he's been hiding his shame all along." He hooked his thumb under the clasp, only to pause dramatically, scanning the room with a predator's grin. "What's your guess?" he barked. "Stale bread," someone shouted. "Rotten cheese," another answered. "Nothing, it's empty," came a third. The room trembled with uneasy laughter. But even in their mockery, voices faltered, as if each worker feared being wrong. The manager leaned close to the box, whispering just loud enough for all to hear, "Whatever it is, it ends here." The janitor's lips parted, but no words followed. He simply inhaled, slow and steady, his chest rising against the weight of dozens of eyes. Then he lowered his gaze, hands folded as if surrendering to the tide. The clasp squealed. The crowd hushed. But the manager stopped once again, savoring the power in their silence. He closed the clasp with a snap and stepped back. "No," he said smugly. "Not yet. Let's make this worthwhile." Groans and sighs filled the room. A few laughed nervously, though no one truly enjoyed the delay anymore. The suspense had become unbearable, dragging sharp against their nerves. Yet no one left. No one could. The box had become a magnet holding them all. Minutes stretched like hours. Every glance at the desk felt heavier, every tick of the clock louder. Even the hum of the machine seemed muted, as though the factory itself waited. At last, the manager raised his hand again. "Enough. Time to reveal." The crowd leaned forward, breath caught in their throats. Even those at the back pressed closer, necks craning, hearts thumping. He placed both hands firmly on the box, palms flat against the cold metal. His eyes flicked to the janitor, daring him to stop it. The old man remained still, neither protest nor approval in his expression. And for the first time, a flicker of doubt touched the manager's face. Why wasn't the old man afraid? Why wasn't he desperate? The question gnawed at him. But pride shoved doubt aside. With a sharp grin, he snapped open the clasp once more. The hinge groaned. The lid lifted an inch, and the room leaned in as one. What lay inside was hidden still, but already the atmosphere had changed. Something about the weight of that moment pressed on their chests, stealing air from their lungs. The manager smirked, dragging out the reveal. "Get ready to laugh," he whispered. But when the lid rose higher and shadows began to part, the first glimpse silenced even the cruelest among them. The lid creaked open, its rusty hinge groaning like an old door. For a split second, the crowd held its breath, ready to laugh, ready to sneer, only to falter as the first shadows of the contents came into view. It wasn't bread. It wasn't fruit. It wasn't food at all. Inside, layered with care, lay a collection of objects that didn't belong in any lunchbox. A bundle of yellowed papers, edges curled with age. A stack of coins, dull but unmistakably precious, each one stamped with faces from another century. A handful of old keys tied together by a string, their metal worn thin from use. And, tucked neatly in the corner, black and white photographs whose edges were frayed but whose images remained clear. The workers blinked, unsure whether to laugh or frown. The silence stretched too long. Someone chuckled nervously, breaking the stillness. "What is that? Junk?" The manager seized the lifeline, laughing loud and sharp. He plucked one coin from the box and held it up. "A fortune in garbage," he sneered. "Our janitor collects scrap metal. Shall we sell it for a loaf of bread?" Scattered laughter followed, though thinner than before. The objects carried a strange weight, a sense of purpose even if no one understood why. The papers smelled of dust and history, the coins glinted faintly under the fluorescent light, the keys jingled with echoes of doors long locked. The janitor said nothing. His eyes followed the manager's hand as it rummaged carelessly through his belongings. His shoulders stayed square, his posture calm, but his silence seemed deeper now, heavier, as if he carried knowledge that the others could not yet see. The manager picked up one of the photographs and held it aloft. It showed a group of men standing proudly in front of the factory's main gates, decades earlier. Among them, younger, stronger, and sharply dressed, stood a man who looked unmistakably like the janitor. The resemblance was clear. Same eyes, same lines of the jaw, though filled with youth rather than years. "Look at this," the manager mocked. "Our janitor thinks he's someone important, playing dress-up in old pictures." Some workers laughed. Others frowned. A murmur rippled across the crowd, confusion more than amusement. A woman near the back whispered, "But, that's him, isn't it?" Another muttered, "He looks like he belonged there." The manager ignored the murmurs, flipping through the papers now. "Contracts, receipts, signatures, nonsense," he declared. "Worthless paper he's been hoarding like treasure." But the words rang hollow. The ink may have faded, but the signatures were bold, sharp, unmistakable. The documents bore names long etched into the company's history, names carved on plaques in the lobby. The crowd leaned closer. Their laughter had vanished, replaced by a strange unease. One of the older workers, who had served the factory for decades, gasped softly. His eyes locked on one particular name. "Wait," he whispered, his voice trembling. That's the founder's signature." The words landed like stone dropped in still water. Ripples of silence spread through the crowd. Faces turned pale. The manager froze for a heartbeat, then scoffed. "Forgery," he snapped, waving the papers dismissively. "Old junk. Don't be fooled." But doubt had already taken root. The worker's eyes darted between the manager, the papers, and the janitor. The cruel certainty that had filled the room only minutes before was crumbling. The janitor stood unmoving, his hands resting gently on the desk. He had not defended himself, had not begged, had not spoken more than a warning. Yet already the tide was shifting. His silence spoke louder than the manager's shouting. The coins clinked softly as the manager tossed them back into the box. He slammed the lid shut with a bang, trying to reclaim control. "Enough of this," he barked. "It's all worthless. A box of trash from a life long wasted." But no one laughed this time. The silence was heavier now, pressing against the walls, against their chests. Whispers spread again, but different whispers. Not jokes, not mockery, but questions. Why does he have those papers? Why is his picture with the founders? What do those keys open? The manager felt the shift. His grin wavered. His eyes darted nervously across the crowd, realizing the laughter was gone. The workers no longer looked at him for guidance. They looked at the janitor. The old man lifted his gaze, slow and deliberate. His gray eyes scanned the room, not accusing, not pleading, simply watching. The silence deepened, and in it, the workers saw something they had missed for years. Not weakness, not shame, but patience, and beneath patience, power. The manager slammed the box shut once more, louder this time, as if noise could erase doubt. "Back to work," he barked. "Show's over." But the show was not over. It had only just begun. The crowd didn't scatter when the manager barked his order. Machines waited cold and still. Tools lay untouched. The factory floor had become a courtroom, and no one was willing to leave before the verdict. The lunchbox remained on the desk, its lid shut, but the images of what had been inside burned into everyone's minds. The coins, the papers, the photographs. Doubt now whispered where laughter once lived. The janitor stood quietly, his hands resting against his sides. He had said nothing. He had done nothing. Yet the weight of the room had shifted toward him. It was an older worker, a man with thinning hair and grease-stained overalls, who finally broke the silence. His voice cracked as he spoke, but every word landed with force. "I've seen that signature before," he said, pointing at the stack of papers still clutched in the manager's hand. "It's in the lobby, on the plaque. The founder's name. That's the same hand. The same stroke. I'd swear on it." A murmur swept across the floor. Heads turned toward the plaque hanging in the distance, framed under glass, gleaming with pride. The founder's signature was etched in brass for all to see, and yes, the resemblance was undeniable. The manager scoffed, though the color drained slightly from his face. "Nonsense. Old tricks. The ramblings of a man too stubborn to let go of garbage." But his voice didn't carry the same authority it had moments earlier. Doubt cracked its surface. Workers glanced at one another, eyebrows furrowed, lips pressed thin. The janitor still said nothing. He let the silence stretch, and in that silence, the weight of truth grew heavier. One of the apprentices stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly. She reached toward the photographs still scattered on the desk. The manager tried to snatch them away, but she was quicker. She lifted one high so all could see. It showed the gates of the factory decades earlier, bright and freshly painted, with banners strung across them. In the front row of men stood three figures: the founder, his business partner, and another man younger, sharper, his eyes unmistakable. The crowd gasped. They didn't see just resemblance. They saw recognition. "It's him," the apprentice whispered. "It's really him." The janitor didn't deny it. He didn't nod. He simply stood, letting their realization bloom. The manager's voice cracked. "Coincidence? Anyone can look like someone else in a faded photo." He laughed harshly, a laugh too forced, too brittle. "You people are letting your imaginations run wild." But the laugh fell flat. The factory wasn't buying it. Not anymore. The silence thickened. Workers shifted uneasily, shame creeping into their expressions as memory replayed itself in their minds. The years of mockery, the cruel jokes, the careless whispers. They had laughed at him every day, dismissed him as invisible, mocked the very man who might have been the root of the ground they stood on. Another worker stepped forward, this one younger, his voice firm. "If those are real documents, then this factory still belongs to him." The manager turned pale. His hands shook slightly as he shoved the papers back into the lunchbox. "Enough," he barked. "This circus ends now. It's nothing but scraps of paper." But no one moved. No one left. Instead, they all turned their eyes toward the janitor, waiting. For words. For answers. For truth. And finally the old man lifted his head. His eyes, gray and steady, met theirs one by one. His voice, when it came, was low, but clear enough to slice through the thick silence. "Respect," he said simply. "That is all I ever asked." The words were few, but they echoed louder than any speech the manager had made. A shiver ran through the crowd. Respect. It was the one thing he had been denied, the one thing they had stolen day after day with their laughter. The manager staggered back, sweat beading his forehead. He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came. His authority was crumbling, brick by brick, under the weight of a single word. The janitor reached out, placing his hand gently on the box. He did not open it again. He didn't need to. The glimpse had been enough. The truth was already alive, spreading like fire through dry grass. The workers stood in silence, their shame thick as smoke. Some lowered their eyes. Others pressed their lips together. The factory, once full of cruel noise, had become a cathedral of quiet. And in that silence, respect began to grow. Too late for apologies, too late for excuses, but not too late for the lesson. The janitor lifted the box, tucking it under his arm with the same care he had shown every day for decades. He turned toward the door. But before he could step away, the branch director, who had arrived quietly during the commotion, raised his voice. His tone was grave, steady, commanding attention. "This," he said, gesturing to the scene before him, "is a day none of you will forget. Not because of money. Not because of papers. But because of the mistake made here." The staff hung their heads. The manager sank into his chair, pale, trembling, stripped of power. The janitor did not linger. He walked toward the exit, the box secure in his arm, the silence following him like a cloak. For the first time, the factory didn't laugh. The door frame held him for a moment. One step from leaving, one breath from ending it without another word. Then the janitor paused. He looked back at the crowd, at the manager wilted in his chair, at the director standing solemn as a judge. His eyes fell last upon the lunchbox. The room followed his gaze like iron drawn to a magnet. He returned to the desk, set the box down, rested his palm on the dented lid. No drama, no flourish, only patience. "I never asked you to believe me," he said quietly. "I asked you to let me work." He lifted the clasp with a soft click. The lid opened, not to spectacle now, but to testimony. First came the papers, pulled carefully, one by one, laid flat across the desk like a map leading backward through time. The nearest sheet was thin as moth wing, its edges browned, its letters slanted with the deliberate pride of an earlier age. At the bottom, a signature, bold as a banner. The founder's name. The director leaned forward. He didn't speak. He didn't dare. His finger hovered above the ink as if touch itself would be disrespect. "These," the janitor said, "are the original deeds, transfers, renewals, amendments." He tapped the second page. "Here is the clause the lawyers wrote when the partner sold his portion. Here," he unfolded a third, "is the stipulation that the founder's remaining share passes by blood and by will." The manager tried to laugh, but nothing came out. His throat clicked dry. "Anyone can print old letters. Anyone can," the janitor agreed. He reached deeper into the box and produced a small leather ledger, cracked along its spine. "But not anyone can keep this for 50 years. He opened to a page where the ink still held its blue. "Payroll entries," he murmured, tracing the neat columns. "Dates. Amounts. Notes. Including one line the founder wrote the night my father died." He turned the ledger for them to see. The room leaned as one. In the margin, "Advanced to the boy. He understands the floor better than the office ever will." Silence moved through the crowd like a wave. The janitor lifted the stack of black and white photographs. He placed 3 in a row, the factory gates draped with banners, the founder and his partner shaking hands, and a third, cleaner, closer, of 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder. The man in the middle was young, jaw tight, eyes steady. The founder's hand rested on his shoulder. "Is that you?" the apprentice breathed. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Time had added weight to his face, silver to his hair, but left the structure unchanged. The line of the cheek, the lift of the eyebrow, the way the eyes did not seek approval. Recognition had already anchored itself in every watcher's mind. He reached next for the keys, 5 of them tied with a faded ribbon, each labeled in a neat, old script. "Office vault. Tool room safe. Foundry cage. East Annex records." The director spoke at last. "Those locks were decommissioned decades ago," he said slowly. "Replaced during expansion." "Some were," the janitor replied. He slid one key free and held it up so it flashed in the harsh light. "Some were not. And some were decommissioned in speech alone." He nodded toward the far wall, where a steel cabinet stood half-forgotten behind a rack of new safety posters. "That one still turns." All eyes swung toward the cabinet. The manager found his voice. "This is absurd," he snapped, but the word landed thin, already defeated. The janitor did not move to the cabinet. He set the keys aside and reached for a velvet pouch tucked beneath the papers. From it he poured the coins, thick, heavy discs that thudded into his palm with the authority of history. Not shiny. Not gaudy. Serious. He laid 3 on the desk. The closest bore a monarch's profile, another an eagle, the third a mint stamp long extinct. A veteran worker inhaled sharply. "My grandfather collected," he whispered. "Those aren't scrap. Those are museum pieces." "They were a promise," the janitor said softly. "The founder told my father, keep these if I fail you. Sell them only if the men on this floor are not fed. I never sold them." His gaze lifted, steady. "I never had to." The manager slumped deeper into his chair, a man shrinking inside his suit. "Why?" The apprentice's voice wavered. Why did you never say anything? Why, if all this is true, why clean floors? Why carry this alone? The janitor's mouth softened, not quite a smile. Because a place is not owned from a plaque, he said. It is owned from the ground. I wanted to know how the ground was treated. He glanced toward the manager. And who felt brave when mocking a man with a broom? No one laughed. The sentence stood like a bell tolling the hour. The director straightened, drawing breath as if surfacing from deep water. If these documents are authentic, he said carefully, the lineage of ownership is messy, the janitor finished with a weary nod. Lawyers will argue. Boards will posture. I've watched men in suits circle paper like dogs around a bone. He laid a final document on the desk. A will. Short. Unadorned. This was witnessed by two men who are now names on your lobby wall. It grants me what the founder called a deciding share. Not the whole. Enough to stand in a room and say no. The words "say no" landed like a door closing. The manager was sweating openly now. This is manipulation, he stammered. A trick, old props. Enough. The director's voice cut cleanly. He looked not at the janitor but at the workers, at their bent heads, their stunned faces, their shame. We've made a spectacle of a man we should have thanked. We have treated dignity like dirt. He turned to the janitor and bowed his head, not as a performance but as repair begun. Sir, forgive what was done here today. The old man shook his head gently. Forgiveness is not mine to sell, he said. Respect is not a coupon you redeem when watched. He gathered the papers back into their order, slid the photographs beneath them, returned the coins to the pouch, retied the ribbon around the keys. Every motion was careful, ritual, the choreography of a life lived in maintenance. When the lid closed, the room exhaled. A young worker cleared his throat. What happens now? Now. The janitor lifted the box. He tested the handle with a thumb as if confirming it would hold one more day. Now I go home. And tomorrow, he met the apprentice's eyes, you decide who you are without an audience. He turned to leave, took one step, then stopped again. He faced the manager, not with fury, not with triumph, but with the plainness of truth. You thought power was a laugh loud enough to make others echo, he said. Power is the quiet that remains when laughter dies. The manager flinched as if struck. Around him, the circle of workers widened, not to follow the janitor, but to give the manager space to sit alone inside the wreckage of his pride. The director spoke once more, his voice low. There will be an internal review of conduct, of culture, of what we honor here. He paused, letting the promise settle. Beginning now. The janitor nodded once, neither grateful nor dismissive, only acknowledging a necessary sentence finally spoken. He walked, past the desk, past the machines, past the plaque that had for years told a story without its last chapter. As he reached the door, the factory did not applaud, did not cheer. It stood in a silence that was no longer cruel, no longer empty. A silence of recognition, of learning. The door opened. Daylight bled across the floor. He stepped through. And the room left behind felt different, because it was. What followed would not be spectacle but consequence. And consequence would belong to the one who had built his throne from laughter. He did not fall all at once. Pride rarely does. It loosens one thread, then another, until the suit that made a man feel invincible hangs wrong on his shoulders. After the door shut behind the janitor, the factory stood in that new silence, heavy, honest, unmistakable. The director remained near the desk. Workers drifted back toward their stations, but their faces had changed. Their eyes no longer sought the manager for cues. They looked through him, past him, around him, as if authority had relocated to the place where the door had just closed. Back to work, the manager said, attempting steadiness. The words came out thin. No one jumped. No one scrambled. People moved because it was time, not because he had spoken. That difference scraped across his nerves like grit. He tried routine. Few tyrannies are stronger than routine. He stalked the aisles, hands clasped behind his back, posture sharpened to a blade, searching for a mistake to bite. But the floor gave him none. Operators checked gauges with unusual care. Apprentices calibrated twice. A veteran tightened a valve he'd ignored for weeks. Everywhere he looked, diligence outpaced his hunger for fault. The director called him, quietly, firmly, to the glass office that overlooked the floor. Inside, the air felt thinner. 2 HR officers waited, their notebooks closed, pens aligned. The manager sat, tugged at his tie, and arranged his mouth into a confident line. We'll need a written account, the director said, tone measured. of today's events, your role, and your prior interactions with the janitor. The pause before janitor wasn't disrespect. It was recognition. The title was now too small for the man it had tried to contain. An account? The manager scoffed. Of what? A prank? Old paper? We're modernizing. I'm managing culture. Culture managed itself today, the director replied. And it rejected mockery. A beat. Your language, your staging, your encouragement of group humiliation. This violates policy. It violates decency. The pen tips lifted. The first notes began. He pivoted to bravado. You want numbers? I have numbers. Output rose last quarter under me. Downtime dropped. If a few jokes kept morale. Morale is not laughter at the weakest, one HR officer said, voice steady. That is fear. And fear is brittle. The manager laughed, too loud, and immediately regretted it. The sound cracked the room's calm, and all three faces across from him stayed still, unimpressed. We will speak again this afternoon, the director said. For now, step back from the floor. Observe only. No interventions. It sounded like a safety instruction. Felt like a leash. He stood, nodded as if the decision were reasonable, and left the office wearing a smile that tried to look temporary. On the mezzanine, he paused, gripping the rail until the knuckles paled. Below, the factory moved with the same rhythm it had always had, only without him at its center. The sight chilled him. What is a king when the village keeps working? He descended the stairs. Two workers at the bottom stepped aside, not deferentially, not nervously, simply to avoid him. He muttered a thanks that tasted like dust. At lunch, he sat alone. The table that used to collect sycophants stayed empty. Conversations nearby folded around him like water around a stone. He checked his phone out of habit. Messages from numbers that once flooded him had slowed to a trickle. One text from a team lead read, "We'll send the incident summary by 3. No greeting. No name. Administrative, not loyal." He stabbed at his food, then pushed the tray away. Appetite had left with the laughter. When the whistle blew, he prowled again. No walked, predators stalk, people walk, and found himself at the far wall where the steel cabinet stood behind safety posters. He stared at the keyhole as if it might blink. Decommissioned in speech alone, the janitor had said. The words lodged like a shard. He reached for the handle. It didn't give. He tried the edge of a nail to pry under the lip, a childish motion that left a crescent of pain. He let go. Behind him, a pair of apprentices rolled a cart past, eyes ahead, chins high. He remembered how they used to rush to move for him. Now they moved correctly, not quickly. There is a difference. By mid-afternoon, an email arrived with a subject line built to puncture. Interim restriction of duties. He opened it and read each sentence twice, as if repetition could soften edges. Effective immediately, he would refrain from direct employee discipline, public announcements, and all calls on the floor. Meetings with HR were scheduled. A review of leadership style would follow. He felt his throat tighten as he reached the signature block. No first names. No smiley face. Just titles stacked like bricks. He closed the laptop and looked through the office glass. The plaque in the lobby caught a shard of light. He had passed that metal story 1,000 times without really reading it. Now the etched signature connected to ink he had called garbage. It was as if the building had developed a memory, and it remembered against him. The day did not end quickly. Time expands when pride contracts. He tried to call a supervisor he considered an ally. The call went to voicemail. He began a message, deleted it, began another, deleted that too. Words betrayed him. Words that had once whipped a room now tangled in his mouth like wire. Late in the shift, the director returned. He did not ask questions. He set down a thin folder, a preliminary report, and spoke without heat. You are not the first to confuse attention with respect, he said. But today everyone else learned who we are. Tomorrow you will decide who you are. The sentence bruised because it offered a choice. Punishments sting less than mirrors. I built results, the manager said, but the statement sounded tired. This place needed order. It needs dignity, the director replied. Order without it is just noise with uniforms. The director left the folder and walked away. The manager did not open it. He knew what was inside. Bullet points he could not out-argue, observations he could not unsee, dates that lined up too neatly with his jokes. Evening approached. Workers clocked out in steady streams. Some glanced toward the office, most didn't. Indifference, he discovered, is heavier than hatred. The factory emptied, swallowing noise until only the hum of the lights and the tick of the lobby clock remained. He lingered as if staying late might look like leadership. In the lobby he stood before the plaque at last. The founder's name, the partners, the witnesses. He imagined a young man with steady eyes beside them, a hand on his shoulder, a photograph that had waited in a lunchbox while he rehearsed clever lines. He wanted to tear the poster that read "We respect the work." He wanted to shout that he had been hired to fix, to sharpen, to set standards. But the room had no extras left to perform for. The audience had gone home. Outside, night pressed its face against the glass. He saw his reflection layered over the etched names and realized the placement was not flattering. He looked like a ghost trying to haunt a house that didn't fear him. On his way out, he passed a maintenance cart. A rag lay folded with military neatness on top, a small kindness to a common tool. He thought of the janitor's hands, how they moved with that same care even when mocked. The thought struck cleanly like a note played true. Care is a language. He had been illiterate. He reached the door. His hand paused on the bar. The floor behind him was dark, patient, unimpressed. He pushed through into the cool air. He did not fall all at once. He fell in the quiet after the applause ended, in the spaces where jokes used to echo, in the long walk to a car that didn't feel like his anymore. He fell in emails without names, in meetings where he was invited to listen, not speak. He fell in the moment he finally understood that power borrowed from humiliation returns itself with interest. And tomorrow the review would begin. Not of numbers, of the man who had chased them. He did not return the next day. The janitor had no need. His work was complete. Not the sweeping of floors, not the polishing of rails, but the unveiling of truth. Truth, once shown, does not hide again. The factory floor moved with a different rhythm now. Workers spoke softer, watched closer, carried themselves with a carefulness that had nothing to do with machinery. They had witnessed what silence could reveal, and the echo of it still clung to the walls. But the man at the center of it all was gone, walking streets that paid him no attention, carrying the same battered lunchbox at his side. On the outside nothing had changed. The city bustled, horns blared, vendors shouted, children weaved between crowds. The old man blended into it all, gray against gray, his coat flapping like the wing of a bird too tired to rise. To strangers he was invisible. To those who had seen him he was unforgettable. He walked without hurry, his shoes tapping steady against the pavement. Each step felt lighter than the decades behind him. Not because wealth had been revealed, not because respect had been forced, but because his dignity had endured. He had not shouted, not fought, not demanded. He had simply been. And being had been enough to unravel arrogance. At home, his apartment was as small as rumor had suggested. A single chair by the window. A kettle scarred from years of use. Shelves lined with books yellowed at the edges. He placed the lunchbox on the table as though it were a guest, opened it with the same gentleness as always, and removed the contents. Not to prove, not to flaunt, but to remember. He brewed tea. Steam curled upward, fogging the glass of the window as night pushed neon against the city skyline. He sat quietly, sipping, his eyes watching the blur of traffic below. He thought perhaps of his father's words, of the founder's hand on his shoulder, of the long years when silence had been his shield. He thought of nothing too. Peace often comes not from thinking but from resting. Meanwhile, back at the factory, stories grew. Workers who had seen the box began telling others. Families, neighbors, friends in corner shops. A businessman typed a message to his colleagues. Never judge by appearances again. A mother whispered to her child. Respect everyone no matter how small they seem. An apprentice, shaken but awakened, swore quietly to herself that she would never again measure worth by clothing or titles. The tale moved faster than steel could be forged. It traveled through texts, through whispers in cafes, through pauses in evening dinners. The invisible janitor became a phrase carrying weight, retold in awe, in shame, in admiration. Each retelling added polish to the lesson. Arrogance humiliates itself. Dignity does not need to shout. The manager's fall became part of the tale too, but only as a shadow. People remembered his laughter, but more than that, they remembered its silence after it collapsed. He was not the main character anymore. He was the warning, the footnote carved into memory. Do not become him. And the janitor? He did not care for legend. He cared for his tea, for the sound of pigeons tapping against the ledge outside, for the pages of books that spoke in the quiet voices he preferred. Wealth, papers, keys, all those things he kept safe not because they made him powerful but because they were his, because they carried stories, because they were the roots beneath the tree. He did not seek applause. He did not grant interviews. He did not even return to the factory to claim anything more. He had proven nothing to anyone but himself, and that was always enough. The world around him shifted, though. The factory's culture changed, slow but sure. Apprentices learned from day one. Respect is not optional. Supervisors checked their tone. Workers caught themselves before mocking. The lunchbox was not there anymore, but its echo haunted the air, reminding them, silence can thunder. And in the small apartment, the janitor poured another cup of tea. He leaned back, eyes heavy, heart unburdened. For the first time in decades, he did not feel invisible. Not because people saw him, but because he no longer needed them to. His exit was not fireworks, not headlines, not speeches. His exit was a walk through the city, a cup of tea, a chair by the window. It was dignity intact, carried quietly, like a flame that never needed to roar. Respect, he knew, could not be forced, but it could be lived. And once lived, it could not be forgotten. The story of the lunchbox did not end with the old man's quiet walk home. Stories like that never end where silence begins. They ripple outward, retold in factories and offices, in kitchens and classrooms, until the moral settles deep into memory. This one was no different. Workers carried it to their families that very night. We mocked him, some admitted, shame bending their voices. We mocked the very man who carried the keys to the place we stood in. Parents retold it to their children, never judge by clothes. Never laugh at silence. Never mistake humility for weakness. By the end of the week, the janitor had become legend. He had no part in this spreading. He sat in his small apartment, brewing tea as always, but outside, his name transformed. He was called the Invisible Millionaire. The man who silenced arrogance. The lesson in worn shoes. The words multiplied, attached themselves to him, though he never sought them. The manager, on the other hand, shrank into whispers of warning. His downfall became cautionary tale. Beware the arrogance that feeds on mockery, for it will choke you when silence arrives. The factory kept running, but it no longer ran on his commands. He had lost the one currency he never valued, respect. The truth of the story was not money. Money was the stage. Dignity was the play. The janitor's wealth had grown quietly, like roots beneath the soil, unseen, ignored, underestimated. But when the storm of arrogance struck, those roots held firm. No insult, no ridicule, no laughter could shake them. His silence had been strength, not weakness. His patience had been resilience, not surrender. And that was the lesson. Not that riches hide in boxes, but that worth hides in people. People dismissed, overlooked, mocked. The ones who polish rails, sweep floors, carry worn coats, walk unseen. The world forgets that value is not written on fabric or titles. It is written on character, on how one carries themselves when no one is watching. Those who witnessed that day never forgot. They remembered the hush heavier than any shout. They remembered the way a single word, respect, silenced a room that once roared with cruelty. They remembered the truth that respect cannot be bought back once it is thrown away. And the janitor? He never demanded they remember. He never wrote speeches or gave interviews. He lived as he always had, steady and quiet, his box still beside him, his tea still warm in the evenings. His lesson required no stage, no spotlight. The world had already taken it, already made it echo. Respect has no price. Arrogance has no future. Silence, when filled with dignity, speaks louder than laughter ever could. And that was all. That was enough. If this story moved you, let it remind you of something simple but powerful. Never mock what you don't understand, and never measure a person by appearances. Dignity is silent, but its echo lasts forever. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from so we can see how far this lesson travels. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, and leave a like. It helps spread the reminder that respect costs nothing, yet it changes everything. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today.